Hello everyone, my name is Marco Landry, and in this video I'll show you how to upgrade the suspension on your Yamaha R3. So in my case, I'll be upgrading this with the NIX-22 cartridge from Ohlins. So with this specific model, you can adjust the compression damping on one leg, the rebound on the other leg, and you can also adjust the preload, and all of these adjustments are done via the top cap. So let's get started now. In terms of tools, you will need a 6mm X wrench to loosen up the pinch bolt on the top triple. You'll need a 14mm on the lower triple to loosen up that pinch bolt here. A 22mm socket to loosen up the top caps on both sides. You will also need a T50 Torx socket in order to loosen up and remove the bolts that are holding the caliper in place. You will also need to figure out what type of tools are required to remove your clip-ons. So let's get started. So the first step from me, I'm going to loosen up the clip-ons. So this is simply a 5mm Allen wrench here in my case. And I'll do the same thing on the other side. So now I'm going to use my T50 Torx socket to disassemble the bracket for the brake. In my case, I'm using an aftermarket Brembo caliper that's connected to a bracket. If you still have your OEM setting, you're still going to end up using that T50 Torx socket to remove those two bolts. In my case, there was no brake fluid in the brake line, so it was easy just to simply remove the caliper. In your case, if your fluid is in the lines, just make sure that there's no unnecessary pressure pulling the brake line down. So you can even zip tie it to your radiator as well. So now I'll loosen up the top caps with the 22mm socket. When you're doing this, you don't want to remove the top cap. You simply want to loosen it up because it's a lot easier to do this when everything is mounted on the bike. All right, so now that the top caps are loose, I'll loosen up the pinch bolts for the lower triple. So one thing that I should mention as well earlier is that when you remove this, if you're going to reinstall them exactly like they were before, if you don't have to do any other changes to the geometry of your bike, you want to measure the amount of chrome exposed above the triple tree. So in my case here, it's a distance of 26.2 millimeters. So this is the amount of chrome that's exposed. When I reassemble this, I want to have the same amount of chrome that will be exposed above the top of your triple tree. So in my case, I've changed the geometry of the bike a little bit because I've installed a new Ohlins suspension in the rear, and it's higher than the OEM setting. So I know for a fact that in my case, when I reassemble this, I want to have a distance of 25mm that's exposed. That's going to be my settings, but if you haven't changed your suspension, if you want to keep the same geometry, just make sure that you measure this and you take note of that measurement before you disassemble the fork from the triple tree. We are all set to remove the fork from the triple. The only thing that's retaining this in place now is that pinch bolt at the top here. This one is already loose. We've loosened up the top cap, so we're all set to remove the left leg. So when you do this, you want to make sure that you hold the leg with your left hand and you unscrew the pinch bolt with your right hand. All right, so the first fork is out. So now we're going to repeat the same thing on the right side. And when you're doing this as well, make sure that your clip-ons are going to be in a position where nothing is being kinked, like there's no kinks in your wires, or you're not going to damage anything by leaving it loose somewhere on the side of the bike. So you want to make sure that it's positioned properly so that nothing gets kinked or damaged while you're doing the air work. So in this case here, I think I'm just going to put it here, and that should be good enough. So this way, no kinks, no bent, and it's going to be perfect like this. You can always zip tie it if you wanted to zip tie it as well. Now I have the left leg or the clutch side fork in the vise. This is my Motion Pro vise. I've cleaned up everything with some brake cleaner. I'll remove the top cap, and after that we'll remove all the internals. So in this case I'm simply going to use a 22mm wrench because it's already loose, so it should be fairly easy to remove. And while you're doing this, you want to apply some downward pressure as well to make sure it doesn't pop out. Alright, so now we have the top cap removed. So now we're simply going to remove the preload spacer. I'll remove the fork from the vise, and now we will just simply empty the oil, and while emptying the oil we should also get the spring that will fall out, and also the washer that was on top of that spring. So there we go, now we have the spring and the washer that are both out. So now I'll just leave it and then go like this for a little bit so that some of the oil will drain out of the fork. So now I'm going to use an 8mm internal X. So this one is fairly long, as you can tell, to remove the bolt that's holding the damping rod in place. So this is the bottom of the fork. So you simply have to insert this here, and it shouldn't be too tight. So when you do this, there's probably going to be a bit of oil still that will drip, so I'm going to simply move my tray on this side here, and I'll reorient the vise so that the oil drops into that pan there. It's been dripping for a little bit. We'll remove the fork from the vise, and I'll simply turn it upside down to get the damping rod out of there. So when you remove the damping rod, that bottom spring here will need to remain into that tube, so you don't need to remove that small spring. Alright, so just to recap, we've removed the top cap. After that, I removed the preload spacer. Then we remove the washer, then the spring, and I just finally remove the damping rod. And make sure that this small spring at the bottom stays in the fork. So we are now all set to start the installation process of the Ohlins cartridge. In order to determine which one is which, you will see that on the top cap, this one says COMP and your one says REB. So we know that this is the compression. So once you remove this top cap from the cartridge itself, you will want to tread this nut here just enough so that you can use your pull tool to tread on top of it as well. So this is a tool that you'll need to purchase separately. It doesn't come with the unit. I have a Motion Pro unit, but the Motion Pro unit was not fitting on this one, so I had to buy this separately. So after you have installed the pull-up tool, now we can simply insert the cartridge into that fork. The new cartridge is in the fork. Now I'm going to reassemble the bolt that was at the bottom here. In my case, I have some new titanium bolts that I'm going to use instead of the standard stainless steel bolt. So I'm going to simply remove that little washer, and I'm going to reuse a copper washer on that Allen bolt. Before we reassemble everything, I'm going to put some blue Loctite on this as well. So if you plan on reusing the same bolt that you remove, make sure that you clean it up and there's no Loctite remaining on it before you apply the new one. And again, this is the long X 8mm socket that you're going to use to put this back in place. And I've cleaned up everything as well before reassembling this. So I removed all the oil, took some brake cleaner, and make sure that everything was nice and clean. Normally, I would probably disassemble everything and clean up everything before I reassemble this, but since the fork is fairly new, I didn't see any need to do this. And then again, the torque spec for this will be 30 nanometer. All right, and when I'm trying to screw that bolt, I can feel the cartridge spinning inside. So I'm going to take my impact wrench and just try to get it to tread properly and just pull it down a bit more, and hopefully it's going to stop spinning. And then after that, I can use the torque wrench to finish the process. All right, folks, so I finally managed to torque this down to the right specs. I was trying to use the torque wrench and the cartridge was spinning all the time. I would get to about 10 or 15 nanometer and everything was spinning. So I had to revert back to my impact drill, and I would drill and rotate the bolt by a quarter turn, and then I would try again with the torque wrench, measure the torque specs, and it took me probably about 10 minutes to do this properly. But the only way I was able to do this was with the impact wrench. It's secured at 30 nanometer, and now we are ready to start pouring the fork fluid inside of the fork. So in my case, I'm using the Motul factory line light. It has a viscosity grade of 5W. So the Society of Automotive Engineering is using a really broad scale to grade the viscosity of these oils. So instead of using the viscosity listed on your container, so the 5W in this case here, it's a lot more accurate to use the centistoke value. So centistoke is a measurement unit for the rate of flow. For this specific kit, Ohlins is recommending to use the 1309 product code, or the oil with the product code 1309, which has a viscosity or a centistoke of 19. I couldn't find this Ohlins oil anywhere close by, and to ship it was a bit of a nightmare. So I've selected the Motul oil because the centistoke value for this specific oil is 18. So the 1309 fluid from Ohlins has a viscosity of 19 centistoke. So this Motul oil here has a viscosity of 18 centistoke. So very, very close. So I'm mentioning this because when you compare two different products with the same weight, their viscosity value or their centistoke value might be totally different. And that's because of the SE broad calibration scale that they're using to weight the different oils. So for example, if you compare Motul 5W with Silcolin 5W and the Maxima 5W, their respective centistoke value will be 18, 22, and 16. So you can see that for the same type of oil, at least from a label perspective, if you compare the same weight of oil from three different vendors, their rate of flow will be very, very different. So that's why when you look at the specs for the suspension, you want to make sure that you compare the centistoke value and not the weight of the oil, because that's going to make a big difference in your suspension. All right, so enough talking about the oil. Now we're going to start pouring this into the fork. So I filled this very close to the treads of the top cap. So now what you want to do is be able to move the fork up and down so that you release the air that might be trapped in the fork itself. So I'll go up and down about 10 times to release the air that might be trapped in the fork. And now we'll do the same thing, and I'll go up and down again about 10 times, but this time using the pull tool to release the air that might be trapped in the cartridge. We'll do this about 10 times, and you can feel that the pressure is changing as you do it. So I have my fork oil level gauge here. I've set it up according to the Ohlins specs at 130 millimeters. So what we'll do now is that we will remove the first 130 millimeters of liquid from the fork itself. And when you do this, you want to make sure that everything is compressed so that your inner tube is fully seated in your outer tube, and that the cartridge itself is fully pushed down as well. And then we will start removing the liquid. All right, so now we've removed that liquid. And you can reuse this. Like this is still very good oil, so I'm just going to pour it back into my container here, and we'll reuse this on the next fork. So now that this is done, we are ready to start the next step, which will be to put the spring inside. And when you insert the spring, you want to make sure that the markings, there's some markings at one of these two ends, and you want to make sure the markings are facing up. They are very difficult to see. That's why I need to put my glasses on here. The numbers that I have is 08429-75. So those two last digits here, the 75, means that in this case, the spring rate is 7.5 Newton per millimeter. So this spring was specifically picked based on my weight. Obviously, you can change this if the suspension doesn't behave the way you'd like it to behave, but I'm going to start with this because that's the standard for my weight or my total weight with my equipment. And you can mix and match these springs, but obviously if you're going to do this, I would probably recommend that you speak to someone at Ohlins to make sure that you have the right combo of springs. So we're going to simply make sure that I have the numbers at the top, and we'll just slide this in. Okay, so this is the second leg here that we're doing now, and I'm going to insert the spring with the markings facing up. So we'll put the main spring in, and the oil is already inside as well, so it's set up the right level. The next step will be to put the spacer in the alignment ring. So there are some holes on the alignment ring, and the holes have to go on the spacer. So it will look like this here. The hole is facing up, or it's connecting to the spacer. So the alignment ring will sit on the spring, and the spacer will sit on the alignment ring. So this is the order that it goes in. So if we put this in like this, you'll see now that we have the spring, the alignment ring, and the spacer. So the next step will be to use the stopper plate and pull the shaft up with the pull tool, and you press the spacer down just a little bit so that you can insert the stopper plate between the spacer and the nut. And once this is in place, we can remove the pull tool. You can use your fingers or a 13mm wrench to make sure that the nut is at the bottom of the treads. Once this is done, what we're going to do next is use the O-ring that was supplied by Ohlins, and we will insert that on the top cap. Normally, before I do this, I use a bit of grease, seal grease, to put on the ring. I just dab it in there and make sure there's a nice coating on that ring. Just spread it around with your fingers, and then you can simply slide it on the top cap. So basically it will look something like this here, where you push this down on the tread. It's a bit difficult now with slippery fingers. And once this is in place, we will now apply some grease on these threads before we screw this on the top tube. So you could, in theory, just use the regular grease, but I've always been doing it this way. So I'm a creature of habit. I don't think there's any harm in mixing both. So now we have a nice coat of grease. Now I'm going to install or thread that top cap on the rod here. So you use a 13mm wrench to hold the nut, and then take a 14mm wrench and just secure or tighten these two items together. Once you have this done, you can just take your hand and pull the spacer down, and with your right hand you can remove the stopper plate. And after that, make sure that everything is lining up properly. By lining up properly, I mean that the spacer needs to stay properly in the ring, and also lines up properly inside the bottom of the top cap. And now we are ready to start threading the top cap on the inner tube. So in order to do so, you simply want to pull that inner tube up, and while you're pulling this up, you can push the cap down and start threading. And to finalize the process, what you're going to end up needing is a 36mm socket that will go on top of the top cap, and then you will secure this at 10 nanometer. Everything has been mounted, so the new Ohlins cartridge are now in my OEM forks, and we are now at a point where we need to set these up properly. So this is my Rebound leg, and in the manual from Ohlins, they're recommending to start with 12 clicks for the Rebound, and for a rider weight of 90 kilo with a spring rate of 7.5 Newton per millimeter, they are recommending that we go with a preload of 8mm. And in order to adjust the preload, you will need a 13mm wrench, and you will use the nut at the top, and whenever you do a turn clockwise, it will increase the preload by 1mm. So right now, both of these settings, my Rebound and my preload, are set at 0. I mean, everything's been dialed down counterclockwise to the maximum that I could go. So I will need to do 12 clicks for the Rebound adjustment. And here in this case, they're saying for, no, again, 90 kilo with no gear, it should be 8mm of preload. I think I'm going to start at 7mm because I'm not quite at 90 kilo. If I was to go the next step up for that same spring rate, they're saying to do 9mm of preload. And the maximum adjustability for the preload, I believe, is around 15mm. Going at 7 will bring me almost in the middle, so that should be a good start. And I can always increase it if it doesn't work properly. But for now, again, I'll start with the 12 clicks for the Rebound, and I'll do 7 turns for the preload. So let's start with the 12 clicks. So I'll go left first, or counterclockwise, make sure that it's dialed to a 0, and we will go to 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. All right, so that's for the rebound leg. So now we'll put the compression leg in, and the settings for this one are 8 clicks. So same thing again, 8 clicks, and I'll do 7 turns for the preload. All right, so when you do this as well, keep some notes on this, because if you ever adjust it again, you want to go back to your baseline all the time. So for me, that's my baseline. The other thing that you will want to capture when you reinstall this on the bike is, again, the amount of chrome that will resurface above your 333. So that's it for the settings, guys. Now I'll just remount this on the bike. All right, folks, I'm back. I was really hoping to finish that project yesterday, but it turns out that I decided to do a bit more work. I took my top 333 bracket and I grinded off all the studs that were sticking out, and also the area where the key switch was. So there was a piece of metal here that was sticking out. So I shaved all of this, shaved the 2 studs underneath, and then refinish everything properly. And now I have my bracket that's nice and clean. Yeah, I think it looks much nicer now. I don't have this extra metal that's sticking out. Now I'm all set to start reinstalling this on the bike. And once we have the top triple on, I'll start reassembling the forks. All right, so now we're gonna slide in the left fork in. And don't forget to reinstall your levers as well. I could have done this after the fact, but everything is already preset, so it's easier to do it now. And this is not the final resting place. I just want to install this and get my top triple bracket, my top 333 bracket aligned. And when it's aligned and secure, we will make sure that we have the right amount of chrome that is resurfacing on top of the top triple bracket. And when you're doing this, you want to make sure that all your cables are properly routed, because the last thing you want to do is assemble everything to realize that you didn't route your cables properly. All right, so now we will secure this in place, and the torque spec for the steering stem bolt is 95 nanometer. And when you secure this in place, make sure that your pinch bolts are loose, because if your pinch bolts are tight, your bracket will never sit properly. This is a 22 millimeter socket here that I'm using, and again, 95 nanometer of torque. Okay, so now I'll be adjusting the height of the front forks. And what I want is to have 25 millimeter of chrome that's sticking out above the top triple. And this is always a lot easier if you can get someone to help you out while doing this. And when I'm measuring the top of the chrome area, or the tube, not the adjuster on top, or the top cap. I'm measuring just the tube itself, and what I'm seeing right now is 25 millimeter of chrome that's being exposed. The forks have been reassembled, and the 333 pinch bolts at the top and bottom have been torque to specs. The torque specs are 21 millimeter or 21 nanometer for the top, 30 nanometer for the bottom bolt. So make sure that you follow the torque specs. You definitely don't want to over tighten this and damage your top tube. In my case, I have an aftermarket Brembo caliper with the Spears Enterprise bracket. The torque spec will be the same. So in my case as well, I've replaced the bolts with some titanium bolts, but the torque specs for these will be the same as the T50 torques that you will use to mount the OEM brake. The torque specs are 35 nanometer. So I'm going to put just a dab of blue Loctite. All right, it's now time to install the wheel back on. I've already installed or partially installed the front fender, and I purposely didn't secure any of these fasteners. I just want to make sure that everything was aligned. By tightening this the right specs here, my fork should align properly, and after that I'll be able to tighten the titanium fasteners holding the front fender in place. All right, so in my case here, I'm going to use a 17 mil wrench and a 19 millimeter wrench. All right, guys, everything is done. Everything has been torqued to spec. It's moving well. I'm able to move the steering from left to right. The cables are moving well. Nothing gets caught up in the forks. Everything is working properly for the suspension. I bounced it a few times, made sure everything was working okay. I forgot to mention earlier that you will need 1 liter of oil. So I've used almost a full liter. There's only a little bit left. If you want to be on the safe side, you can do the same as I did and buy 2 of those, and you'll have an extra one for later. But 1 should be sufficient to complete the full process. So on a scale of 1 to 5, I would probably rate this a 3. It's not super complex. If you follow the instructions from Ohlins, it's going to be fairly straightforward. I would also make sure that when you do this work, invest some money into the shop manual from Yamaha. I mean, I refer to that shop manual on a regular basis. It's really helpful. It allows you to really understand how everything fits together. Also, the torque specs are well documented in there, so that's another good thing to have handy as well. So that's it for today, guys. Hopefully the video was helpful. If it was, please smash that like button. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, as usual, shoot me an email, connect with me on social media, or post your comments below. And until next time, drive safe, stay safe, and we'll see you soon. Cheers.